In today's world, we hear the term Global South more and more often. The Global South is the largest, though still symbolic, group of countries in the United Nations. Depending on how you count, they make up around two-thirds of all 193 UN member states. And Ukraine's interest in Asia, Africa and Latin America has grown significantly since the full-scale invasion. There is now a real need to unite the world, at least around condemning Russia's aggression and war in Ukraine, and ideally around supporting sanctions against the Kremlin. And my guest today is British author, political commentator and former diplomat Arthur Snell, someone who knows quite a lot about this global dynamics. Arthur, it's my pleasure to have you here in our studio online.
Well, it's my pleasure to join you. Thank you.
So, Arthur, let's start by explaining to our viewers, how are you personally connected to the topic of the Global South and to Ukraine in general?
Yeah, well, thank you, Natalie. So I guess there's two ways that I have a link to this. The first is that in my career as a British diplomat, I worked quite extensively in some of these countries that we're talking about. In particular, I was posted in Zimbabwe, in Nigeria. I also worked in Yemen and in Afghanistan. But there's something more relevant here, which is that after the full-scale invasion, like many British people, of course, I wanted to see if I could play a productive role in the response to Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. I'm not a soldier. I don't have a military experience. But what I do have is a diplomatic experience. And so I was able to get involved in a program that was originally being supported by the US government to help Ukraine's engagement with Global South countries. In particular, as you rightly identified, Natalie, in your introduction, many of these countries have a tradition of close relationships with Russia. And in some cases, these countries did not initially see Ukraine's perspective in what should be a simple question of sovereignty and legality. So it was my honor, really, to get involved in a program to help Ukrainians reach out to the Global South and to make their case, to show their side of the story, with the objective of increasing support for Ukraine in some of these crucial Global South countries.
Okay, Arthur, now it's more clear. And before we discuss its importance for Ukraine and Europe, let's clarify who we mean by the Global South. Is there any exact list of these countries? And actually, what unites them? Geography, economy, political systems, or perhaps their colonial past? And should we even keep using this term of the Global South?
Yeah, it's a good question because, of course, like all these labels, there are always exceptions and there are issues that don't quite add up. You know, in the past, some people would talk about the third world. That's now seen as an archaic, old-fashioned terminology, or they might talk about developing countries. But in broad terms, we're talking about countries that are geographically to the south of Europe and North America and Northeast Asia. So countries that are found, obviously, Africa, very significantly, Southeast and South Asia, and of course, Latin America, so particularly South America and parts of Central America. There are common factors. Not many, not all, but many of these countries were colonized by European powers. And most of these countries gained their independence after World War II, when the sort of large European empires broke up. But of course, when we talk about imperialism and colonization, for people in Ukraine and in other countries in Eastern Europe, your memory of colonization is much more recent with the Russian experience. So in a way, there isn't a simple definition, but it tends to be countries that have a prior experience of European colonization and who in more recent years, in the 2010s, 2020s, have seen their own economies expanding and have started to acquire a sense of their own power and influence in the world that perhaps historically they did not have.
Okay, so just let me clarify. Was you traveling around these countries, right, with the Ukrainian delegations?
Yes. So there were several delegations made up of prominent Ukrainians from civil society, academics, human rights activists, journalists, this sort of thing. I did not join all of these delegations, but for example, I joined one to Nigeria, which is, of course, the biggest population in Africa. So we're talking about, in some respects, the most important population in terms of engagement and, of course, its government, a powerful, significant country. I was also able to travel to Ghana, not as big as Nigeria, but still a very important country. It has a lot of political influence across the continent. And so what we were doing really was we were taking these, as I say, civil society activists from Ukraine and really taking part in a kind of diplomacy, but what we might call a sort of civilian diplomacy, not from official diplomats, but from ordinary Ukrainians who are there to explain what it is that they're doing, what is their story, what has happened to their country with Russia's illegal invasion, and why is this important? And really, as part of that experience, I gained a lot of knowledge, of course, about Ukraine, about the experiences that you've had, particularly since the full-scale invasion. But I also learned a lot about the challenges that countries like Ukraine and its partners in the West face as they try to persuade countries in the global South that what Russia has done is very obviously a criminal act, a war crime, and against, the interests of the global community.
And okay, then was that a serious argument for those people? How in general, like for instance, people in Nigeria, what did you notice about how those people were seeing war in Ukraine, Russian war in Ukraine?
Yeah. So the thing to explain is that Russia has done a very good job, and of course it has its friends in China in particular, has done a very good job of shaping the media narrative in global South countries, but especially in Africa. This is partly done through Russian channels such as RT, of course everyone knows this TV channel, but it's also done with a huge amount of online activity. So in fact, just after the start of the full-scale invasion, obviously the end of February 2022, there was a massive online effort by Russian disinformation networks to promote the hashtag I stand with Putin. I mean, who stands with Putin? Nobody. But this hashtag went viral in a lot of African countries in particular, and on social media. So what you have is there's a mixture of factors here. One is, as I've mentioned, this kind of media and social media effort, which is much stronger than what we see in Europe. I mean, in Europe, there is a lot, of course, of Russian effort to spread disinformation, but the effort is probably stronger in Global South. The second thing is history. Now, many of the countries which came out of the experience of European colonialism, let's say in the 1950s and 1960s, gaining independence, they joined what we call the non-aligned movement. So they were trying not to be allied with Western countries, but equally not to choose sides with Russians in the Cold War. But what that meant was that over time, Russia did a good job of building up its relationships with these countries, often in the form of military technology. Of course, as we all know, Russia has a huge arms industry over the years, the Soviet arms industry. Of course, some of that was in Ukraine. And they were able, partly by selling cheaper weapons that were perhaps easier to operate than some of the systems coming from NATO countries. Over time, Russia built up its relations in the global South. But the third thing, which is an important part of this history, and I think is less well appreciated, is the size of the diplomatic networks. So if we think about what happened when Ukraine gained its independence and, of course, or regained its independence and, of course, alongside other former Soviet republics, at that time, all over the world, what had previously been Soviet embassies, Soviet Union embassies, became Russian embassies. So immediately, the Russians had a huge network of embassies in every country in Africa, every country in South America, and so on. At the same time, Ukraine, for example, had to establish new embassies, acquire property, recruit diplomats, gain expertise. So even now, if we're talking in 2025, there's still many countries in Africa that do not have a Ukrainian embassy, whereas the Russian embassy has been there for decades. So Ukraine faced all these disadvantages, which really were made more visible at the start of the war in 2022.
Okay, so what arguments with those countries were not effective at all, that you thought it should be effective, but it doesn't?
Well, that's a great question. I think one of the arguments about the idea of the war itself and the sort of bad behavior of Russian military in terms of war crimes were not very effective. And this is because if you look at Africa, particularly in the Sahel region of West Africa, very sadly, there's been very serious violence, not in the form of state-on-state conflict, not the invasions that obviously Russia has carried out, but major violence caused by weak states, by militants, by Islamist terrorism, and so on. And so if someone turns up from Ukraine and says, well, the Russians are killing our people and they're committing war crimes, it is not that someone from Nigeria doesn't believe it or they lack humanity, but they will say, well, how much do you know about what's happened in our country? And of course, many tens of thousands of people have died in violence from groups like Boko Haram. So that's an example of an argument which would work very well in Western Europe, where we are shocked, we're disgusted by what happened in Bucha, but it may not work so well in West Africa.
Yeah, Arthur, you're right. But what I cannot understand so far still, that we have a lot of things in common together. We were also, as Ukrainians, were also oppressed. We know what in slavery means in practice. So when I see such a behavior of African countries, kind of the denial to support Ukraine, it seems like they just want to be against the West, and they see Ukraine as a part of the West.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Natalie, that the perception. So in many places, we heard this story that, well, this war was started by Ukraine because Ukraine wanted to join NATO. And this is a proxy war of NATO against Russia, which, of course, you in Kyiv, you hear that and you think, God, I've heard this argument so many times. But that argument has been allowed to seep into the consciousness in many African countries or across the global south, again, thanks in part to the strength of the Russian disinformation networks. But I wanted to pick up on something else you said, Natalie, because it's so important. That the argument, we're talking about the arguments that don't work, but the argument that does work actually is the argument about colonialism. Because in all of these countries, you're talking about countries that have struggled against colonial oppression. Maybe they faced racial and ethnic oppression as well. They've faced this idea that they've been treated as a secondary civilization by a foreign occupier. And of course, these are all things that is familiar to Ukrainians. The Russians are trying to colonize you. They treat Ukraine as not a real country, not a real civilization. The Russians basically treat Ukrainians as second-class citizens. So when you explain to audiences, and I could just give a practical example, we were in a university in Ghana, in Accra, and there, among others, Oleksiy Haran, who is, of course, a well-known Ukrainian historian, speaks very good English, he's a very articulate guy. He explained in that sense of a historical context that what Russia is trying to do is to recreate an imperialist empire. And of course, Ghana has the pride of being one of the very first countries in Africa to gain its independence, and it guards that independence very fiercely, as you would expect it to. So when you start to explain those kinds of messages, then actually the students in that audience at this university, they realize that this is much more complex than just like a simplistic idea that Ukraine is a kind of proxy force for Western powers.
Wow. And speaking actually about Alexei Herань, I found his quote, and probably you're going to like it. For Ukraine, which is used to thinking of itself in the coordinates of East and West, the South is unexpected mirror and maybe a new direction. So what might Ukraine see in that mirror from your perspective, or see in that reflection?
Yeah, so there were many aspects to this. One thing that we saw, actually, particularly in Ghana, Ghana is not a rich country. It has some natural resources, but there are many people who are living as subsistence farmers, and we visited a farming region where, although there is fertile ground and there is, the rains had fallen as they should. It was a good year for farming, but many farmers could not plant that year because they had they could not afford fertilizer. Why not? Because one of the many effects of Russia's illegal invasion was that the global cost of fertilizer shot up. As you'll be well aware, the invasion created this commodity spike with various key resources being being unaffordable. So this has a simple impact. There in Ghana, people are going to go hungry because of Russia's illegal war. So, of course, Ukraine is one of the world leaders in agricultural technology, and that may be one of Russia's many reasons for its invasion, to seize your well-run agribusiness farms, alongside many other reasons, of course. One of the delegates on our team is someone who's an agronomist, a specialist in this area, and it was possible to set up various connections so that there is an ongoing sharing of expertise between the sort of agricultural technologists in Ukraine and those farmers in West Africa.
Yes, and so in practical terms, as you mentioned, lots of those countries are not that rich. But how can these countries help us? Are they really capable of imposing sanctions on Russia? And do they even have that economic strength to do so?
Yeah. So I think, obviously, in terms of economy, or like what we see from Europe in terms of supplies of weapons or something like that, that's not practical. That's not going to happen. But there are other ways it's very important. So one of the ways that Russia has been able to, what we might say, avoid the full penalties that it deserves for its illegal actions, is to create a sense that there is still some debate. That there's a debate to be had over whether or not its war in Ukraine is somehow to be condemned. As we know, of course, the UN Security Council, because Russia sits on that council and its friend, the Chinese, the UN Security Council has failed to act in the way that it should have in the face of this, flagrant disregard of international law. So, although these countries may not be economically very powerful, although that's changing rapidly, Nigeria's economy is growing, Ghana's economy is growing, Ethiopia, so on. But aside from the economics is the influence on the world stage. So it's very important, for example, that in the UN General Assembly, that actually Russia receives almost no support now. The only countries really supporting Russia are the ones that are in Russia's pocket, places like Venezuela, Cuba, and so on. So that's one thing. I think another thing is pushing back against these narratives of a world divided, so that Russia and China would like to create a scenario where there is a world of autocracy and most global South countries will support the Russians and the Chinese in their behaviors, and ignore the plight of a democracy, a liberal democracy such as Ukraine. Now, what's been interesting is that actually over time, thanks to some of this work, but of course many other activities, over time, what's interesting is that Russia has not really gained support for its actions. You know, that at the beginning, yes, there was some ambiguity, but actually a lot of countries are very, very concerned by this, not least because if you are a country that has recently gained your independence, when I say recently, within the last 50 years, territorial integrity is incredibly important. You know, the borders of a young country are more easily questioned. And so these countries face the same fears that we would face in Europe when we see what we regard as fixed borders being ignored by the criminals in Moscow.
Yes. You know, regarding the United Nations, in 2022, I was a part of a media scholarship. I won it as a Ukrainian journalist, and I was in New York for 3 months during the UN General Assembly and so on. And I remember while working there, sitting on the huge lobby, there was some African diplomat, and gosh, I don't remember the exact country, but he came to me and said, listen, you have to have a deal with Russia. And like, how do you see it? And we had kind of a not very pleasant for me a conversation as a Ukrainian who just came from Ukraine. And, it, you know, I was quite emotional back then. And he said to me, what are you going to do? What you going to do with the combat mosquitoes? And then I realized the real strong power of Russian propaganda there on the continent.
Yeah.
I was like...
And so... Yeah, absolutely. And then, of course, the other thing that the Russians have done really in that short time period since those experiences that you had is that they have also expanded their footprint on the ground. So as we know, what was previously the Wagner Group, which then, you know, rebranded as Africa Corps, this is now active in many countries in West and Central Africa. And this is, you know, the Wagner Group, Ukrainians know what this is. It's a criminal mercenary gang. It treats civilians with complete disregard. The way it has treated civilians in the Donbass is the way it is treating civilians in West Africa. But what it's doing there is making partnerships with corrupt leaders in some of those countries, not all, but in some, exploiting minerals, gold, diamonds, other types of enrichment opportunities. And so the power of Russian propaganda has in some cases led to, sad to say, countries falling under Russia's direct influence. However, the encouraging thing is that the bigger countries in Africa, the ones that have the greatest influence, are for the most part avoiding being sucked into this sort of mistake of thinking that Russia is the solution to their problems.
Yeah, true. And so Arthur, just to sum up, since 2022, it's the year when we actively has intensified its, you know, engagement with these global South countries. What real achievements do you see from that work so far?
Yeah, well, I would say that the first thing is if you just look at the voting record in the UN General Assembly, and that's, you know, we have to ignore the Security Council because unfortunately, you know, the Russian veto there means that it doesn't function now. But the General Assembly, what you actually see is the support for Ukraine has remained very strong. So even countries that might have quite good relations with Russia, maybe they rely on Russia for weapons or for other support, when it comes to these important votes, they have supported Ukraine. The second thing is the vast improvement of knowledge of Ukraine's situation as a result of the work of some of these delegations, and of course the hard work of Ukrainian diplomats. But we have to remember that, as we've talked about, the Ukrainian diplomatic network is much smaller than the Russian one. Some of the things are hard to measure, but they're significant. So if I just take one example, the population of Nigeria is enormous. You know, it's 150, 160 million. So if you are on live TV on the main channel that people watch for news in Nigeria, there will be tens of millions of people watching. Now, when we took the delegation there, I remember that we managed to get them, onto the news channel one night, and they explained to the watching audience what was happening in Ukraine. No one was preventing them. There was no filter of propaganda, of Russian propaganda. So that's one example. But another example has been actually, for example, in the Nigerian parliament, because of the direct lobbying undertaken by some of our delegates, the lawmakers there have passed resolutions empowering their government to take a much more supportive line with Ukraine. Now, of course, if you're sitting in Ukraine right now and there's Russian drones flying overhead, it's hard to feel the effect of these things because, of course, it takes a while for the effect to flow through, and the effects are long-term and intangible. And, of course, it doesn't stop the drone from flying overhead. But in terms of the global rejection of what Russia has done, I think Putin may have been very surprised. He probably thought he would get more support from some of these global South countries. And over time, it has actually fallen away.
Yeah, I think we're just at the beginning of this diplomatic huge work with the African countries and actually global South in general. And it's so many work ahead and in front of Ukrainian diplomats. And actually, in 2023, there was a very common thing that you see open vacancies in the embassy of some of the African countries, and you was able to go to work there, maybe not like the Ukrainian ambassador, but still somewhere as a Ukrainian representative.
Yeah, that's interesting. And certainly, I can see that. So we interacted with the Ukrainian embassy in Nigeria. Now, of course, Nigeria is a big country. You would expect to find an embassy there. But in scale, it was a fraction of the size, for example, of the Russian embassy. And ultimately, as Ukrainians will know very well, the Russians exploited the labor and the both the physical capacities of the Soviet Union, but also the human capacity in the form of labor. And they will have been doing that with the Soviet diplomatic networks over decades. And now they're benefiting from that. Even now, 35 years after the end of the Soviet Union, they're still able to benefit from some of those historic events.
Yes, Arthur, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your brilliant thoughts, for your experience, for sharing your wisdom with us. And I'm waiting for us to have another hour work together regarding how Putin came to power.
Well, it was my pleasure to talk to you today. I'm always happy to interact with my Ukrainian friends, and I very much look forward to our next conversation.
Thank you so much.